Today's daf yomi is Bava Basra daf Pei Zayin Bava Basra 87. We're going to start on Pei Vav Amabez on 86b, around 10 lines from the bottom. Today's daf is dedicated for a shmir for the Chayalim, Hatzalah for the Shvuyim, and a Yeshua for Am Yisrael. And this Eis Tzara, Rav Shmuel, the Amri Travayu, Rav Shmuel, both of them taught Kur B'Shloshim Ani Mocharocha. They both said the following: that if a person comes along and says, I'm selling you a bushel of wheat for 30 seya, kor b'shloshim ani mochacha, yachol achzerbo, then the person is able to retract, the seller can retract, and the purchaser can retract afilu b'seya achrona, until they get to the final seya. The sale is not done. If he's pouring in, let's say, the wheat into the basket, up until he gets to 30, it's not done, and he can retract. But let's say he says, seya v'sela ani mochacha, rishon kana. But if he says, I'm selling to you a seya for a sela, meaning 30 seya, but each seya is a sela, then rishon kana. Then each time he pours in one drop, he acquires it. The Gemara challenges this. Tashma, it says, the Brisa says, mida shel echamei and rishon kana, v'afagav lo nisma'u amida. It says in the Brisa talked about if there was a measure that belonged to one of the people, in this case the purchaser, then for every drop that goes in, he's acquired it, and even though it was not full. So we see from here that he acquires it one drop at a time, not like the first case of Rav and Shmuel's statement. So the Gemara says, no, could go into Amrlay hin b'shnei masar slayim lug b'sela ani mochacha. No, it's where he said to him, I'm selling you a hin for 12 sela, and each lug, which 12 lug make up the hin, is going to be one sela. So there, it's like the second case of Rav and Shmuel's statement, where he buys it each drop because he specified. Ukidam Rav Kahana, like Rav Kahana taught with respect to every measure that was in the base of Mikdash for the oil and the nesachim. It says Shinaso Sayubahin, and on the side of the measuring utensil of the temple, which was called the hin, there were marks, and each mark was a measure of another lug. So you can measure for each korban the amount that was needed for the libations. So too in the midos, the measuring utensils that they were selling in them, there was a measuring mark of the lug, and each lug was considered like a specific measure, and so therefore that's how it was acquired. And so therefore Rav and Shmuel said that this is like the second case of Rav and Shmuel. So the Gemara again challenges Rav and Shmuel, and this time brings us back to our days of Ezu Neshech. Tashma sochar asapoal, somebody who hires a worker, let's say you hire the worker and you want him to work for you in the summer, in the harvesting part, but you pay him today, hayom b'dinar, that today the value is 1 dinar. That's how you can get a worker, because there's nobody harvesting today. And if it would be the time of the goren, then it would be a sela, would be the typical wages. And so therefore that's 4 dinarin. So you're not allowed to pay him. Also, you're not allowed to benefit from him, because that's a form of interest. Rashbam says it's not actual interest, but mishum de milchseki agarnato. It looks like my payment you're holding back from me. That means to say that the worker is giving him a sela in the time of the worker is giving him a sela in the time of the harvest in exchange for a dinar that he's giving to him right now, and then he's being paid later. So basically the worker is saying, I'm going to give you my excess salary in exchange for you giving me this money now. And so that's a form of interest, and I'll pay you more later for what you're giving me now. So therefore you're not allowed to benefit from him. But if he says, I'm going to hire you for the 100 days, and from now until the end of the harvest season, I'm doing that for 100 dinar, and he pays him now. And so even though in the harvest he could get somebody for more expensive, and now he's getting him for cheaper, still that's going to be permitted. So why? Mutter, but why? If you're saying that every drop that comes in, he's actually getting paid right away. So I know each day should be viewed as a different day, and it's the end of the transaction, and he shouldn't be allowed to benefit for the money he's paying now for the work that's being done later on. So the Gemara answers, so the Gemara says, no, that's not going to be a problem. Why? The Gemara explains, we have a little bit of a Girsa issues. Why does it say Mayom Bedino Yom Olgar and It should be a form of interest. It should be prohibited. So I'm a Rav, but do you really think that this is a form of interest and it's going to be prohibited? Zilzui b'schliris mi asar. This is not interest. This is a guy just making his wages less than typical. He's allowed to charge whatever he wants for his wages. And so therefore the Gemara says, well, why in the first case is it prohibited and where he says, I'll be paid now 1 dinar. And in the latter case, it's permitted. What's the difference between the two cases? So the Gemara says, Reisha lo koavid bahadei. So in the first case where he didn't start working right away, then it looks like he's basically agar natarli. It's like it looks like it's the payment for it looks like it's payment for holding of the money, and so therefore it looks like it's a payment for getting the money right away, and so therefore it looks like interest. But Steifa deka avid ba'adei me'asher. But in the concluding clause, where he starts working with him right away, well, it doesn't look like this case, which is this quasi interest. It's never actually interest. No concern was it looks like interest, and so that's not a concern here. The Gemara says v'mayim mechubar b'karka, and if it was attached to the ground and you pulled out the flax a little bit, you've acquired it. So the Gemara asks the question, Mishum the talash kol shulkana. Because he pulls out the flax a little bit, he's acquired it. How can you acquire all the property there just because you put all the stuff on the ground because you pulled out a little bit of flax? So I'm Rav Sheshes, how am I asking in the Amrway, Leich Yafelecha Karka Kolshu, the Koni Komashalan? No, the guy was explicit. The guy said to him, go and pull up a little bit of the ground and then you'll acquire everything that's on it. Says the Mishnah, Hamocher Yayin V'Shem L'Chavero. Let's say somebody is selling wine or oil to his friend, and then the wine goes up or down, or the oil goes up and down, it fluctuates. If it's before the measuring utensil was full, then the seller is responsible for the fluctuations. He gets the fluctuations. That once the measuring utensil is full, and the purchaser is the one who gets the fluctuations. And if there was a middleman there, Nishbara Chavis, then if the barrel breaks, Nishbara Sirsur, the Sirsur is responsible. And you have to, when you pour the utensil, let's say you say, I'm going to get that barrel of wine, you have to hold it over until 3 drops drip out. Herkina umitzis. But let's say it pools at the bottom. The stuff that pools at the bottom belongs to the seller. But the shopkeeper is not responsible to do these 3 drips. We'll see what this means. And Rabbi Yehuda says Friday afternoon, Erev Shabbos, he's exempt. We'll see what Rabbi Yehuda means. But first, the Gemara says, Hamid the man who owns this measuring utensil. If you want to say it's the borrower's then why is it the seller's before it gets filled up? It's the borrower's utensil. If you want to say it's the seller's utensil, why do we say once it's filled, it belongs to the purchaser? It's the seller's utensil. So the Gemara says, it's the measuring utensil of a middleman who lends it to both of them. And the assumption is that when it's being filled, it belongs to the seller. Once it's filled, he's lent it to the borrower. Gemara says it can't be that we're talking about a steersur. A steersur. Beineim. And then if there was a middleman amongst them, nishbara chav is nishbara steersur. It says in the next clause that if there was a middleman, the barrel breaks. It's the seller's, it's the middleman's responsibility. We call the ratio of a searsor skin. Doesn't this prove that the first clause is not talking about a searsor? The Gemara says ratio mida below searsor. So the Gemara says the first case is a measuring utensil, but the middleman is not there; he just lended them. Safe of the searsor atzma. The last clause is where the middleman himself was dealing with this issue, and since he's there and it's his measuring utensil, then it's going to be considered in his possession. It's like he's purchasing from the seller and selling it to the purchaser. And so that's why if it breaks, he's responsible. And the Gemara says, because every drop it goes in, it's like he acquired it. And then it says here, Kino mitzis that if it pulls on the bottom, it belongs to the seller. Kisalak Rabbi Elazar, Ashkachel was the Iri, when Rabbi Elazar went from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, he found Zeiri. He said, Amrle, Mikan Tana da Asne Rav Midos. Is there somebody here who repeats Mishnayos? That's what a Tana literally means. That he was saying over what Rav said about the laws of measures. Achvuye Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. So he showed him Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi. Amrle, my kakashalach. He said, what's your difficulty? What's your problem? It's just interesting here that Rav is from Bavel, and here Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi goes up to Eretz Yisrael and he says, is there anybody here who heard what Rav said? Because there they didn't know as much from Rav, so he was looking for an Israeli who knew what the Babylonian had said. So Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, what's your problem? So he says, I'll tell you. The Tanan here, Kino mitzis areu shal mocher, says if it pulls at the bottom, it belongs to the seller. But Tanan, well, now we're on top of 87b. But we learned here, Kino mitzis areu zo truma. But we have in the Mishnah in Trumos that if you pour wine into the jug of the Kohen, and so therefore that you're saying that this is truma, and whatever's at the bottom of the wine that's being poured, if it pools, it's still truma. You have to give it to the Kohen. And here we're saying it belongs to the seller. So yeah, Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi said, what's the reason in this case it belongs to the seller? Because the owner gave up hope, so he waived his rights. So that's why it belongs to the seller. But typically speaking, it would be the purchasers. And that's why in the case of the Truma, it belongs to the Kohen, even though it's pooled at the bottom. If the shopkeeper is not responsible to drip the 3 drops. So the Gemara asked the question in Bailu, Rabbi Yehuda Aresha Kai, when Rabbi Yehuda says that on Erev Shabbos Imchashecha, that on Friday afternoon near sunset, he's exempt, is he referring to the first clause, Ulakula, and he's being lenient? And saying that the Tana Kama says you have to drip 3 drops always, but Erev Shabbos Imchashecha, you're exempt. Is that what he's saying? Or is he referring to the Seifa, Odoma Seifa Kol Chumrah? Or is he referring, meaning the Rabbi Yehuda says you're exempt, or is he referring to the next clause where it says the shopkeeper doesn't have to do it, but on Friday, but that's only on Friday afternoon. And therefore he's being strict. So Tashma, let's learn it. The Tanya Rabbi Yehuda Omer Erev Shabbos Imchashecha, Friday afternoon, Chanvani Pater, the shopkeeper is exempt because the shopkeeper is very busy. So it's only Friday afternoon that the shopkeeper is exempt. We see from here that there's an exemption for Erev Shabbos because everybody's busy getting ready for Shabbos. Let's say a person is not getting ready for Shabbos. So we see from here that Friday afternoon you're supposed to be getting ready for Shabbos. That's what you're supposed to do. So says the Mishnah, a person sends his son to the shopkeeper and he has the punjan in his hand. and the a pundion is worth two isarin. So he sends his son to the shopkeeper, and he's got a coin in his hand that's worth the coin. When you break it down, is worth two isarin. Mother will be isar shemen v'nasan lo esa isar. So he gave him a value of oil that's worth a shemen, that's worth an isar. That's what the shopkeeper gave to the kid, and he also gave him a coin change, an isar. Shavar asatzluchas. Of course, the child broke this flask that was carrying the oil. The ibed as isar, and he lost this. He lost the coin. So who's responsible? So we say under these circumstances, the shopkeeper is responsible. See why? Rabbi Yehuda says the shopkeeper is not responsible. Because what do you think he sent him for? But even the Chachamim who say the shopkeeper is responsible would admit to Rabbi Yehuda when the child was still holding the flask in his hand, that if the flask never left the shopkeeper's hand, then the Chanvani will be pater. The Chanvani will be exempt. And we'll see the exact scenario that the Gemara understands this case to be. But the upshot of the Mishnah that the Chachamim say that the shopkeeper is exempt, because why do you think the kid went with the bottle to collect the oil? And Rabbi Yehuda said, no, the shopkeeper is liable because he shouldn't have done it. So he shouldn't have given it to a kid. So Bishlama be'isar v'shemen b'ha'pligi. I understand that if it's just the case of the oil and the money, that there is an argument. The Rabbanan Savri, what did the Rabbanan hold? The Rabbanan said, listen, I know you see my kid here. My kid wasn't asking to get the oil. He was just telling you that I want the oil, but I didn't tell you to actually fill it up with him. And you can't trust his word. He said, my dad said to fill up the oil. It doesn't matter. He doesn't have the right to say that. He's a little kid. You can't trust the word he says. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda Savar, no, he sent him to get the oil. So of course I'm going to give it to him. Why else would you send him here? But what about the case of the flask that was holding the oil? Avda meosu, aveda midasu. The kid brought the flask. So therefore, since the father gave him the empty jug to bring, then why would the shopkeeper be responsible? Meaning to say, it's 100% that he's losing it, and so therefore nobody owns that. The Rashbam says the chimasho atinok. Once the father gave the jug to the child, the child doesn't know how to watch it. Hefker, who's that? It's considered ownerless, and he's not concerned if it's going to be returned empty. So therefore, the owner should not be responsible. The owner of the store should not be responsible for the jug that broke. So Amar Rav Hoshaya, what we're talking about is a case where the owner of the store sells these jugs. That's what we're talking about. We go into Shenatchal Chanvani Almanas. And so what happened was here that the shopkeeper took it Almanas Labakra. He took the jug from the kid in order to check it, if it was good and if he should really buy it. So that's what's going on here. That let's say you take a utensil to check it and you want to look if you should buy it. You pick up the object to see if you should buy it. And it breaks, chayiv. So then you're responsible to pay. And so therefore, under these circumstances, we're going to say that since he agreed upon a price and he looked at it, the moment he lifted up, he's responsible. And so here we're talking about a case where they agreed upon a price. So when the shopkeeper picks it up, he's going to be immediately responsible for it because he's of the assumption that he's going to find it whole. And so therefore, it's not going to be exempt until he returns it back to the owner, the kid's father. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda does not agree with Shmuel. So it must be the Chachamim. Shmuel is in agreement with the Chachamim that once you pick it up to look at it, it's like you're responsible. Whereas Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. But the Gemara says, but we have a problem with that. Do you want to say that Shmuel is a machokas Tanaim? Shmuel Tanahi? Are we forced to say that Shmuel is ruling like the Chachamim and not like Rabbi Yehuda? We don't want to. We don't want to say that. So we don't want to say that because what Shmuel would say that like the Chachamim. We wouldn't say it as his teaching. So the Gemara says, no, it's actually a Tanahi. Excuse me. Gemara says, El Rabbi Rabbi Yossi Tamar Travail. No, what's the scenario here? We're talking about a guy, the shopkeeper, who sells these jugs. Meaning to say, he came with the money and he sold them a jug. And so since he sold them this jug, the Chachamim say, well, that's why the kid went. That the Chachamim say you're going to be responsible because I didn't say you should give it to the kid. I just told you I wanted, but not to give to the kid. Rita says he's potter because why do you think the kid went? So the Gemara says, if that's the case, if that's what you want to say we're talking about, what's the next clause? Modem chachamo Rabbi Yehuda bizman shatzlochos bi'ad tinok. Moded chavani l'tzocho. Shechavani potter. But what about the next clause in the Mishnah? It says the Chachamim admit in a scenario where the flask remains in the hands of the child the whole time, and he just pours it in. The shopkeeper pours it in. The shopkeeper will be exempt. But how could that be? You said that according to Rabbanan, the father sent the child only to tell the shopkeeper he should send it in the hands of somebody who wants to, and not that he should give it into the hands of the child. So why would the shopkeeper be exempt if he gave the flask into the hands of the child and then filled it up with him? He should be liable in that case. So the Gemara says, therefore, El Amar. Hold on one second. So the Gemara says, what are we talking about here? What are we talking about here? In the top of 88a, that our Mishnah is not talking about a Bava Basra and not a shopkeeper who sells it. What we're talking about here is Rashbam says he took the utensil to measure with it, and so therefore that the shopkeeper basically took the flask in order to measure the oil to give to the child, and so therefore once he takes it, he's responsible for it, and so therefore he couldn't give it back to the child, even though initially the father had basically given it to the child irresponsibly. Nevertheless, he can't give it back. That even though this refers to a case where even though if you're a scholar and it's not a fik photo to return this lost object, it's beneath your dignity because let's say you're not going to walk around with a goat that you find, into your office. But if you hit the animal with a stick, meaning to say you do some proprietary act, then since he hit it, he's going to be responsible. And so to here also the Chachamim agreed to Rabbi Yehuda in a case where he didn't take it, but in this case he took it to measure it, so therefore we're going to say he's responsible. So like Rabbah, that once he does this act on it, he's responsible. And Gemara says, "Heimer da Rabbah b'alei chayim dan kitinu nigra beraisa," because in this case, by an animal that when you strike it, it's going to run away, and so therefore you're responsible. But in this case, why would you say that the damage didn't do anything, that the shopkeeper didn't do anything? Would you really say that once he takes it to use it to measure, he's going to be responsible? So therefore, Rava says, El Amar Rava Aniva Arisha B'chabura Targim Minuha. I and the lion in my group explained it. Umanu Rebbe Zera. Who is this lion in my group? Rebbe Zera. And that you took it to measure for others. And they're arguing about the case of somebody who borrowed something without permission. Now, let's say you borrowed something without permission, and then you return it. So basically, Marasavar. So Rabbi Yehuda, who says that under this circumstance that you returned it, you're considered a borrower, shohavi, and so therefore you're responsible like a borrower. And so therefore, if you return the object to the place you took it from, you're exempt. And the shopkeeper, since he returned the flask to the hands of the child, he's exempt. Umarsa, whereas the Rabbanan say that somebody borrows without permission is a gazlan. He's responsible as though he stole it. And he's not going to be exempt, even if he returns it to the place that he took it from. He's going to be responsible until he returns it to the possession of the owner directly. So this is like the Gemara we had in Bamitzia, Mem Aleph, Mem Gimel, Shol, Shlomidas. So therefore, the Rabbanan would say in this case, he's going to be responsible. The Girsa here, it says Rava Aniva Ari Shebecharabura Targimidua. Rava says, I and the lion in my group explained it. But I was thinking that really maybe the Girsa here is Rabbah, because Rava is explaining that he and Rabbi, we know that Rava and Rabbah, the Girsas, are often interchanged. And he says, me and my Chavrusa, or the lion in my group, Rabbi Zera. It's like his Chavrusa, but Rabbah was a student of Rabbah. And we know that the Gemara Megillah tells us that Rabbah and Rabbi Zera were Chavrusas, because Rabbah invited Rabbi Zera over for the Purim party, and then he ended up shechting him, and he had to resurrect him. So it's more likely in my mind that this should be Rabbah, and said this, I and the lion in my group explained it. Anyway, this is today's daf. If anybody has any questions, happy to address it, of course. The